Okay guys, so here's one of the questions that often get asked around the sacral decompression series, and this is related specifically to femoral compression. So the sacral decompression process actually reduces the femoral compression clearly that occurs between the femoral head and the acetabulum. Okay, so just think about it this way. If the pelvis goes into anterior tilt, or it undergoes any element of sacral torsion, which is a twisting of the sacrum within, laterally within the pelvic basin, so to speak, then what happens is the head of the femur changes its position relative to the acetabulum. So instead of it being given some nice space to work, and that definite positioning that allows the hip total freedom to operate correctly, we end up with compression. We end up with contact surfaces of the acetabulum and the head of the femur in a different location to where they would be normally if the pelvis was in neutral tilt. So again, you imagine imagine the pelvis being in a natural and neutral position, and then imagine it being tilted forward, and you would see that the head of the femur would actually be in a very, very different position. Now this creates compression that results in arthrokinetic inhibition. And for clarity, arthrokinetic inhibition is a down regulation of the neural input to the muscles that surround the joint, because if we put it in base terminology here, because the joint feels threatened. So you can imagine a conversation occurring where the hip is speaking to the muscles surrounding it, saying, well, hey, I'm not in a great position here to produce force. And if you produce all the force you're capable of right now, you're probably going to do some damage to either the head of the femur or to the hip, or both. Okay, so what happens is this arthrokinetic inhibition process, whereby the joint itself tells the muscles surrounding it to down-regulate their ability to produce force. Okay, that's arthrokinetic inhibition in a nutshell, and obviously not the most scientific way, but in a way that hopefully most people will understand. So when the head of when the head of the femur actually goes into that anterior position, when the arthrokinetic inhibition is occurring, there's very little holding the pelvis stable. So what happens as that occurs, the origin and insertion of piriformis are now taken further apart. Okay, effectively you could say that the piriformis is placed on stretch. Okay, and we all know that stretching, any form of stretching, is inhibitory. In other words, it silences the neurological input into that area. So you take origin and insertion of piriformis apart, you start to inhibit piriformis and its stability function around the hip. Okay, so what you also do is you reduce the amount of oxygen that's able to flow through that muscle, eventually leading to things like ischemia, oxygen starvation, which eventually lead to things like lactic acid buildup in the area, and so on and so forth. So now you've got several components. You've got the actual metabolic component, the lactic acid and the ischemia. You've got the muscle itself being placed on stretch, which obviously, because piriformis runs across the top of the sciatic nerve, is now more likely to impart pressure onto the sciatic nerve, which means you've got a pretty nasty set of circumstances occurring, particularly because it's squeezing on that nerve. So what is the treatment for this? Well, usually people generally tend to mistakenly treat piriformis syndrome by stretching. Okay, so they'll put you into all these various piriformis stretches and say, right, let's ease off the piriformis. It's squeezing on that sciatic nerve, therefore it must be tight. Let's lengthen it. That is, to be honest, that is the worst thing you can possibly do, because if you've already got a muscle that's origins and insertions are too far apart, and you just decide to stretch it even further, you don't get rid of the problem, you add to it. And sure, immediately after the piriformis stretching, the person may feel a bit better, but later they're gonna actually find that they're now moving into that new position. This adds to the anterior tilt. It adds to the pressure on the sciatic nerve, and it creates even higher and greater levels of ischemia. So stretching the piriformis is actually the worst thing to do in piriformis syndrome. What you really want to do is run through the sacral decompression pattern as you've been shown in the educational video that goes along with this. Okay, and very, very simply, a lot of it's not one movement over another. It's actually the combined efforts of all of the parts of the sacral decompression series that effectively allow the pelvic basin to return itself back to this neutral position. And once it goes back to the neutral position, femoral compression goes down. As femoral compression goes down, the piriformis syndrome also reduces its impact. Okay, so you can actually, I don't like to use the word treat, but you can correct many of these imbalances, many of these dysfunctions, just by going through the sacral decompression techniques. Now, you do have a couple of techniques within the overall thing that are particularly powerful. Clearly, the circling technique, where you take the knee out in the big wide circle, that is a powerful technique. As is the first of the longitudinal decompressions, where you take the knee across to the opposite side and then pull down through the knee in toward the hip. Both of these movements are they're very, very powerful. But I don't really like people to think about it in terms of, oh, I'll just do one or two of these movements. For the truest impact of sacral decompression, it's best for you to actually focus on the entire series, work your way through the whole thing, and if you do, you'll have gotten all of the right decompression patterns, all of the right mobility patterns to reassert that neutral pelvis and get rid of both the femoral compression and the piriformis issues that are showing. Okay, so that's just to kind of fill in a few little bits there. I hope that was clear. I hope that was understandable. And hopefully it gives you a bit of a better idea about what it is that you're actually doing when you're going through some of these things. Okay, so there you go, guys. Enjoy.